right. Welcome to our Monday Forms training. Today we have our quarterly review of the BRBC, which is the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Form, as well as the ABCD form, only because the two really go hand in hand. Heather and I were talking earlier, and we'll probably touch on the SPBB form as well, which is how the form that you would utilize to negotiate your commission directly with the seller, although there's kind of some gray area there as we were talking about. So we'll touch on that form as well. But the part of the settlement from the National Association of Realtors is that you need to use the BRBC form, or Buyer's Representation Agreement form of some sort, if you are going to represent buyers as far as showing properties or anything like that. So to work with a buyer, they need to sign a BRBC form. Adriana, did you have a question?
Yeah, so it is going effective July 1st for sure. Do you know?
No, August 14th, I believe, is when it all goes into effect. I think,
Okay.
don't hold me to that date, but I think so. I'll keep you posted as things change and as I learn more. But we've been preaching it in our office now for at least 2 years, at least since I started teaching the classes, because I'm a firm believer in the BRBC and buyer's representation agreements. I think that nobody should agree to work for free. And by not having a BRBC in place, that's ultimately what you're doing, is you're saying, hey, I'm willing to go show you properties. I'm going to spend my time with you, knowing that, in fact, I may not get paid because you, number one, may decide to exclude me from your purchase. Number two, you may have had another agent out of the area that you were really, truly working, planning to have write your offer for you. Like, there's just no ability to commit. And so I've been a solid advocate for this for a while. That being said, let's talk about the form itself. If I was going to go show a buyer some properties, make sure this form is signed. If they have questions about it or a way to sell this form or communicate rather this form to your potential buyer, especially a buyer that you haven't met before, like on the Zillow team or a sign call or whatever it might be. One of the best ways to explain it is this is the agreement. It outlines my duties to you and it clarifies our roles. You can decide, I'll show you here in a minute when we get into the form, you can decide whether you want it over a period of time or property specific. So oftentimes if I haven't met a client yet, I would probably make it a property specific form. Like, here's the 3 properties you wanted to go see today. They're written on there. This is just our employment contract. You're asking me to come and show you properties, do work on your behalf, have conversations with those listing agents, set up those showings, and share my expertise with you as we view these properties. In exchange for that, this is what's required. If you decide to move forward with one of these properties, there will be a commission due to me for the work that I've done in getting you to the close of escrow. And for the most part, oftentimes the seller is going to take care of that for you. If there's a chance that the seller's not going to, we will talk about that ahead of time, and I will and we'll talk about how to move forward at that point. Does that sound good? Right? So now it's an employment contract. You wouldn't want to go to work for your employer, right? You wouldn't take a new job and go work for somebody and work for 2 weeks without some sort of contract or agreement in place that you're going to get paid. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, have your employer say, we decided we're going to hire somebody else. Sorry. Thanks for your work these last 2 weeks, though. We really appreciate it. Right? It's the same idea. So if we wanted to make a correlation to our buyers that are kind of balking at it a little bit, that would be one way to do it. Like, hey, it's just saying that, hey, I'm not locking you into a 1-year contract. I'm just saying, hey, for the properties you are wanting me to show you, do work on your behalf, get more information on. If you decide to move forward with purchasing one of those properties, you're going to ask me to assist you with that purchase. I'm going to represent you as your buyer's agent and look out for your best interests. It also gets you an opportunity to explain what your best interests are, what you're going to do for them. This is a great way to explain your value to the buyers as well. What do you bring to the table that somebody else may not, or why would they want an agent at all? So this is a great opportunity to do that. The BRBC form opens up, of course, just like the listing agreement or your purchase agreement. It's got all these forms up front. You can't exclude these. So they get signed at the same time the BRBC form is. The first one is going to be your agency disclosure that just talks about the different types of ways that a client can be represented in a transaction. Okay, they're going to sign that one. Again, you can't exclude these. The second page of the agency disclosure is just the legal jargon that goes with the first page. You've got your fair housing and discrimination advisory, just advising the potential buyer that, as a realtor, we are not allowed to discriminate based on any of the protective classes. Okay, if at any time they feel like they've been discriminated, there is information in here of where they can go to file a complaint. And it's just signing that. Okay. The possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, just letting them know that, hey, at any time I may be representing more than one buyer or more than one seller at the same time. If you decide to make an offer on a property, I have to protect the confidentiality of that offer. So if I'm working with another buyer that also wants to write an offer on the same property, I can't prevent them from doing so. But I'm also not going to disclose to that other buyer the offer that you're making on the property. They've got to come to an agreement of what terms and price they want to offer, just as you would, so that it's clear. You can be represented in a dual agency situation where I represent both the buyer, you as the buyer in the transaction. I may also be representing the seller. If we come to a situation where that's the case, we will talk about how that works ahead of time. Me personally, I don't like doing that. So this would be my point where I'd say, hey, buyer, if you decide to write an offer of which I'm representing the seller of the property, I would hand you off or refer you to another agent to write that offer, because I believe that there's too much gray area in representing both parties. You need somebody to look out for your best interest. Somebody needs to look out for the seller's best interest. And so we just need a degree of separation there, even though we would be under the same brokerage. So technically it'd still be considered dual agency. Your confidential information would be protected by that other agent, right? So I always like to explain that. That's part of my value proposition, right? That's part of the value that I bring to the table. It's also a good point that you may want to point out here that offers are not necessarily confidential. If they make an offer on a property, the listing agent has the ability to share the details of that offer with any other potential interested parties or buyers, unless they send forward a non-disclosure agreement ahead of time, or a confidentiality agreement. I have sent a couple of those over. It's really hard to get a seller to sign those forms, but they could do that if they opted to. So that's your PRBS, or your possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. The other form, before we even get to the real meat of the forms, is the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. I just let my buyers know that, hey, if somebody asks you to transfer funds, please verify not only with me that that would be a agreeable next step, and then I'm going to give you the number for the contact of the person to verify the wire instructions to make sure that we're sending them to the right place. So don't just wire funds because you get an email or somebody calls you and tells you to do so. Okay, that's your wire funds and electronic transfer advisory. Then we have our broker compensation advisory. This is the newest attachment to this form. It came out last month in May. I know that Ed has touched on this form a little bit. And here is the form itself. The first part, it's a little scary, honestly. I would be surprised if they don't come back and try to simplify this form just a little bit, or make one for a buyer and one for a seller, only because by putting it all together, it kind of makes it confusing and a little bit overwhelming. Section 2 and 3 is really what pertains to the buyer's agreement, right? The buyer's broker's compensation agreement. This outlines it. In California, a buyer representation agreement is recommended and required in certain circumstances, which may limit the amount of a buyer's broker to be paid to the amount in the agreement. Buyers and their brokers benefit when the terms of their relationship and respective duties are written, because expressed written terms establish mutual expectations and establish mutual expectations to help avoid misunderstandings. So buyer, that's why we're going to go over this BRBC, or the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, so that we outline our mutual expectations and we help avoid misunderstandings over our duties to each other and the amount of compensation that you can expect to pay me, right? Many sellers authorize their brokers to offer compensation to a buyer's broker in the listing agreement. This may be used to offset the obligation that you may have under the buyer representation agreement, right? A buyer's broker should communicate with the buyer about how the broker will be paid for their work in representing the buyer. In the absence of a buyer representation agreement, if the compensation offered in the buyer's broker to the buyer's broker from third parties is insufficient to meet expectations of the buyer's broker, and the buyer's broker is unable, prior to drafting an offer on behalf of the buyer, to reach an agreement with the seller or the seller's broker to be paid an amount the broker deems adequate, buyer's brokers are not obligated to represent the buyer. Okay, here's the methods for which the buyer's broker may obtain compensation. Buyer pays compensation through a buyer representation agreement. The seller pays the compensation. The buyer negotiates for seller to pay buyer's obligation under the buyer representation agreement. That's really what we're doing with the SPBB form. It's not us negotiating for our compensation. It's the buyer has authorized us to negotiate on their behalf for the seller to cover their portion of the commission due to the agent. That's kind of the workaround for all the legalities of it. Buyer's agent negotiates agreement directly with the seller. If the seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency, right, we can negotiate directly with the seller. Seller's agent pays the compensation to the buyer's agent. The seller may have authorized the seller's broker to offer compensation, right, and that might cover it. So that's the broker's compensation advisory. So if I was doing this, I would say, hey, this is the top section one is for for sellers at time of listing. This section here is what's going to pertain to the buyer's agreement that we're going to talk about today. And I just want to outline those facts to you. I probably wouldn't read it word for word. I'm just going to summarize it and explain to them why we have the buyer's representation agreement, which it talks about in section 2, and then the different ways that I could be compensated for the transaction, either by them or on their behalf. Any questions about the BCA form, the buyer's compensation advisory, broker compensation advisory? I just called it the wrong thing. Sorry.
Nope.
Fabulous. Again, it would be nice to see them split this off into a listing one and a buyer's one. Maybe at some point they'll do that. We will see. The broker or the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement is our next form now that we're 8 pages into this document. So remember, we can't exclude the first 8 pages. We have to include those and this form. So this is the BRBC. It was updated in December of 22 to the BRBC. It used to be called something else. You're gonna representation period and right to represent. In order to be a valid agreement, we need it to have the buyer's names, the broker's information, which is the brokerage, not your individual name. Because again, just like a listing, their agreement technically is with the brokerage and you're the agent representing the brokerage. And then we're going to give it a time frame here, right? So it begins on a specific date and ends X number of days later. It might be 30 days. It might be 120 days. It could be 180 days later, right? So, or just keep in mind too, it's also upon completion of the resulting transaction. So once we sell the buyer one house, this agreement becomes complete. And if they wanted to buy a second house, we would need another buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Section 2 is that there's no pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreement. So if they signed one with another agent, it's always an important question to ask. Have you had other agents show you properties? And did you sign anything with them? Okay, and just signing something, just so you know, doesn't obligate them to pay the other agent a commission. It depends how it was filled out and what they actually signed. So then that's a good time to like pause and have them get a copy of whatever it was that they signed with the other agent to make sure that you're not representing them in a situation where you're not going to get paid at the end. Or they have to pay 2 agents, right? We want them canceled out of a previous agreement for the most part. Property to be acquired Okay, so this would be the vague is A. How vague do we want to be? Okay, B would be the following specific properties only, or the properties identified on the attached list. So if I've got a time frame up here of 610 for 120 days for the properties identified on the attached list, it's only going to cover those properties. Okay, so if I was going to go show somebody properties for the first time, we didn't have a relationship yet, I wanted them to sign this prior to me showing them those 3 properties, I would do an attached list or spell them out right here on the line right above it, so that we know that it's only for these 3 properties that we're seeing today. Okay, you could also do this following specific properties only, which would be B here, and then you could fill them in on that line. You just don't have very much space. So that's really, you're only going to fit like 1 or 2 properties on that line. So that's where you would go on. My guess is, I haven't tried it though, that if you filled in multiple properties here, it would go to a text overflow addendum, and then it would reference that. So then instead of having to draw up a separate list, you could just do that as well, because the CAR forms are usually pretty good about going to a text overflow addendum. Or we could make it vague. Okay, now keep in mind it's either A or B or C. There's no ands there, so you've got to pick one or the other. If we don't check the boxes on B or C, then it defaults to A. Okay, I personally like to be complete and more vague than specific up here. So I might say, hey, I can cover the counties. This also helps to establish your value with your buyer by spelling it out on the BRBC. So this alerts them to the fact that, hey, I can help show you properties anywhere in Solano, Napa, Placer, El Dorado, Sacramento, and Yolo counties, right? So whatever counties you might cover, or if you're doing specific cities, you could do that. In down here on other, you might say to include FSBO and expired and new, expired listings and new homes. Right? So now we've encompassed, hey, buyer, just so you know, it's in writing. They've been made aware of this. I can cover any of these counties. In addition to that, if there's a for sale by owner, if there's an expired listing that you're interested in, or if you're interested in new homes, I can represent you in those as well. Right? So we've just spelled it out on this BRBC, all the different ways, different types of properties that I can represent you in, and that we've agreed that I can represent you in. So you can go counties, you can do location, you can do cities. You may also want to include a price range here. I'd probably go $0 or $1 to whatever the top end of their price range is, plus a couple $100,000. So if they're like, man, yeah, we've been pre-qualified up to $1 million, I'd probably go, hey, we want 1,000 right there. And then if we want to change that down the road, you can do that with a modification of terms, but I would fill it in there as well. Any questions on sections 1 through 3? All right. Section 4 is the compensation. You have a couple of options here, and it does make a nice bold notice that, hey, this is not fixed by law. They're set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. Buyer agrees to pay broker as followed. Applies unless 2 or 3 is checked. Do not check both. Okay, so 1 applies. We can only do a percentage, and if we don't check these 2 boxes, because again, it's an or, not an and. So this would be where you might say, hey, I want a minimum of 2.5% and $1,000. I don't know what you're going to put there. Remember, there's nothing set. It's totally up to you. I'm just filling in some numbers. I'm not telling you what you should charge. Okay, but you could do that. And you don't have to fill in anything on the and. You could just say, hey, it's 2.5%, right? Or whatever your percentage is that you're charging. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 1. Okay, I don't really care. So you could fill in anything there. We don't have to fill in anything on this other line. Okay, 2 would be a flat fee. Hey, I've decided that I'm going to charge you a flat fee for representing you. My flat fee is, again, this is totally up to you. We don't have any requirements, but maybe it's $10,000. Okay. Keep in mind too, that where this may come into play a little bit, where you may want to consider like flat fee versus a percentage, is if you've got a buyer looking a really low price range. Like I've sold a couple properties for like $50,000, and 2% of $50,000 is not a whole lot of income. In fact, it's barely enough to like pay for a transaction coordinator and the transaction fee for the transaction. So you might decide that if it's a really low price range, it might be beneficial to go with a flat rate of like, hey, my minimum is $3,000 or my minimum is $5,000, right? So you might want to do it that way, or you still could go percentage. Or if, even on a regular home purchase or at the average price point, you may decide to go flat rate. It's totally up to you. We have the flexibility to go either route, especially with Realty One Group. Okay. The other option is, or pursuant to the compensation schedule attached. And you're like, Amy, what in the world would that be? Well, maybe we have a compensation schedule that up to 300,000, it's a flat rate of 5,000. Once we hit 300,000, then it's, a 3%. Once we get up to 700,000, now we'll accept 2.5%. And once we get over 800,000, then we'll take 2%, right? So it might be something that changes based on the price range. So we have a compensation schedule. Okay. So it could be something like that. Those numbers were just an idea. I'm just throwing them out there as something that you, what a compensation schedule may look like. Okay. So those are kind of your three options here. Again, we're either going to fill out line 1, or we're going to check a box for 2 or 3 and fill in or attach those. We can't do 1 and 2 or 1 and 3. It doesn't work that way. We can't do 2 and 3. So they have to be one or the other. Any questions about the compensation schedule or compensation section rather?
Amy,
Yeah.
do you feel like would you ever do a compensation schedule? Is that something we should think about understanding? Or I'm personally thinking a percentage is going to be the best way to do this. But I just wanted to maybe get your insight on whether or not you thought some type of schedule would be more appropriate, depending on, because I think where we're going to run into issues is with our first time home buyers, right? So will you be creating a compensation schedule, or are you just going to do a percentage?
Yeah, absolutely. I personally feel like a percentage is probably the best way to go about it. And again, if it's a really low price point or something, then we may want to rethink that strategy again. You may want to calculate out with a buyer that's only approved up to 100,000, or looking at vacant city lots that's kind of the max purchase, like what the minimum is you're willing to work for. So that might come into play a little bit more. Compensation schedule attached. I think the biggest way that might come into play personally, like in my business, maybe if I'm working with like an investor who's kind of all over the board with prices, looking at like true dumps versus like, I only have to do some major cosmetic or some minor cosmetic things to get it back on the market. And so like maybe some of these dumps they're looking at are priced in a route that, for an average commission of 2% or whatever, I'm only going to make $4,000 off of. I'm not sure that I want to go show properties to an investor for 6 months for that much. So I may, that could be a situation where a compensation schedule could be the best route to go.
Got it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, yeah, anyways. So I think, you've got lots of options there. There's no wrong or right one. I think most buyer's agents are probably going to go with a percent of the acquisition price.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Section 2B talks about how or what rights we have to accept compensation under this form. I would highly recommend that we always mark 4B2, which is exclusive representation. Okay, so I like 4B2 because it's exclusive, which means the agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring property in the expectation of being paid for their services. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. That's the only one that really truly guarantees you. If you leave it at the default, which is B1, it's compensations payable only if there was broker involvement with the property. Broker involvement means the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. Broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. Broker submitted to a seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property, or the property was introduced to the buyer by the broker, or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer specifically, or assisting the buyer in potential acquisition of the property, or communicating with the seller or the seller's agent regarding buyer's potential acquisition of the property. So just sending them a list of homes is not broker's involvement. So I would highly recommend you go B2, exclusive representation, just like we exclusively represent our sellers. So whether we find the buyer or another agent brings the buyer for a listing, we still get compensated for that. Same idea here, that if the buyer acquires a home during the terms of this, obviously if it's the following specific properties, it's only going to apply to those properties. Okay. Buyer includes any person or entity other than broker related to the buyer who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 3. So, you know, if I'm showing buyer's property and then all of a sudden at the last minute, they're like, oh, well, my sister's actually buying the property and she's got her own agent. That's the little caveat here. This B3 is what covers you for that situation, that, hey, well, buyer, you sign this, you're putting an offer, your sister's putting an offer on this property. The buyer's representation agreement covered that situation here on number 3. You would still get compensated. Any questions on that section B? All right. C is the cancellation of the buyer representation agreement. So remember, I recommended checking B2 up here. So down here, right? Either buyer or broker may cancel this agreement, giving written notice to the other. It should be terminated if paragraph B1 applies on receipt of the notice, or if paragraph 4B2 applies 30 days after the receipt of the notice. So if my buyers decide to cancel this agreement, because I checked 4B2, it's not immediate cancellation. It's 30 days after I received the notice. Okay, broker shall nonetheless be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or anytime specified in paragraph 4E, that's down here, we haven't gotten there yet, buyer acquires property for which there was broker involvement. CAR form NBIP, paragraph 4B1, provided that there was a list, or if checked, and only if paragraph B2 applies, neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to expiration except by mutual agreement. So I would check the 4B2 and 4C2, which is, hey, no single party can cancel this. It has to be mutual agreement. Okay, I would do mutual agreement because ultimately then it outlines, I'm not going to keep a buyer and hold a buyer hostage that doesn't want to work with me anymore. However, I'm also going to get compensated if they decide to put an offer in on a property that I've done work for them on. So I like C2 because it covers you in that. It doesn't hold them hostage for another 30 days. They could move on with another agent. However, any of those properties that I showed them, I'm going to be covered by checking C2 here. That, hey, it's mutual agreement. And I'm going to let them know that, hey, I'm willing to cancel this, but just a heads up, just so you know, any of these properties that we've seen, if you decide to make an offer and purchase one of those properties, I'm going to be entitled to compensation for it. So it gives me that ability to do that. And I would explain that to my buyers as well, that, hey, just so you know, like, this is checked. It can be canceled with mutual agreement. I would never hold you hostage to working with me if I had done wrong by you and you no longer wanted to move forward with me as your agent. I want you to be comfortable with the house that you're purchasing. So just let me know, and then we can move forward that way. Okay. D is accounting for payments to other to brokers by others, right? So this is, hey, the seller's offering or the listing agent's offering commission. If anyone other than buyer compensates broker for services covered under this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards the buyer's obligation to pay compensation. Okay, that's the default there. The other part of this is if the third-party payments received exceed the buyer's obligation, the excess amount should be paid to the broker. That's the default. So let's say that we said, hey, 2% up here on line 4. 4, right? Maybe we put 2% up here. And then what we're being offered is 2.5% per the listing agent is offering 2.5% to the cooperating broker. This says the default is that extra 0.5% is going to be paid to us. Now it could be credited to the buyer, right? So you could say, hey, if there's a property, the listing agent's offering higher compensation, the seller agrees to pay higher compensation than what we've agreed to, that's going to go as a credit to you, right? That's the second option. The other option is this other line here. Excess compensation should be paid to, and then you could say, split 50-50, 50% of the excess credited to buyer, right? So you could do something like that if you wanted to. You could be creative there, whatever brings you happiness and joy. But if we don't check anything here, then the default is the excess gets paid to us. Okay. 3 is the authorization to include commission in the offer. Buyer authorizes broker to include a term in buyer's offer obligating the seller to pay broker directly through escrow for any compensation that the buyer owes the broker. Okay, so we're, again, negotiating on the buyer's behalf for the seller to pay the compensation or closing cost of the buyer ultimately. Okay, the default is they authorize us to do that. We would do that through the SPBB form. It's the only time we need to use the SPBB form, or the only time you would use it is if you're negotiating for the seller to cover part of the buyer's obligation for commission. Okay, any questions there about C or D?
Amy, so
yes,
would it be appropriate when we do find, hypothetically, I find something that is not offering a commission, is it appropriate when I submit an offer to submit that SPBB if my buyer is saying, Heather, you and I both know I don't have the money to pay you and I really, really love this house. Will you try to see if the seller will pay it?
Yeah, so absolutely. As we move through this a little bit further, you'll see that we're required to disclose to the buyer either at time of showing property or at time of offer what the compensation being offered by other parties are, so that what their responsibility will be on their side of the commission. And absolutely, if the buyer's like, man, I can't cover that additional 2% or the additional 1% or whatever it is, then you can say, well, if you would like, I can negotiate. We can use a separate form and I can negotiate on your behalf as part of the offer for the seller to cover that. Is that what you're asking me to do? Right. So we can do it that way. The other way to do it is we have our BRBC in place. We could just negotiate a straight closing cost credit as part of the offer. So that closing cost credit goes to cover the buyer's obligation as part of the closing, which would cover the compensation that is due to us as well. So there's 2 ways to do it. We can negotiate the commission directly with the seller if the buyer has asked us to do so, or we could negotiate that always with a closing cost credit as well. Those are kind of the 2 ways that we can do it.
So would you have to write that? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. You would
would you have to write that? Because usually when we're negotiating closing, we have to have an amendment that says seller agrees to pay buyer $10,000 closing to be used toward recurring and non-recurring closing costs. So do we need to put in there seller to credit buyer $10,000 toward buyer broker compensation agreement?
It would be a conversation you would want to have with the buyer's lender prior to writing the offer for the most part. Now, lenders aren't requiring reoccurring and non-reoccurring closing costs. It's just anything that's the buyer's cost at closing is being covered. Right. I would say 99% of lenders I've talked to recently, they don't need the verbiage in there. So we're fine on the contract of just checking the box for.
Oh, okay.
seller concessions and writing a number in there and not clarifying what it will be used for.
Oh, okay.
Yep. If I was going to use the SPBB form and work to negotiate it with the seller, to increase the commission being offered, then I would probably have a conversation with the listing agent first to see how receptive a seller might be to that conversation. Because you never know, with all the information that's being thrown out there, you might have a seller that comes up and there's like, well, if I don't have to pay the commission to the buyer's agent, I'd prefer not to. So I don't want to offer anything. But if they want to try to negotiate it with me as part of the offer, I'm willing to. But man, if I can get the buyer to pay their own agent's commission, I'd rather not do that. So you might see properties come up with that the seller's like, I'm not going to offer anything. I'm only going to pay your commission, listing agent, of 2.5% or 3% or whatever they're being asked to pay for the listing agent, but I don't want to offer compensation. But at time of offer, somebody communicates it, right? So that would be a conversation I'd want to have with the listing agent. Like, how receptive are they going to be to me trying to negotiate some commission to make this deal work, because my buyer doesn't have the funds to be able to pay me and I don't work for free. Right?
Right. I think that answers the question, and also actually just makes me have more questions. Because my thought is that was why I was interested in the SPBB, is so if I put in the offer, if I put in the offer that there's a closing credit, do I have to disclose with the SPBB that my buyer? No, I don't. It's not their business what they use the credit for. Got it.
Not their business.
Got it.
Yep. So where a seller may not be receptive to paying you commission directly,
Right.
they may be willing to pay the buyer a closing cost credit because they
Right.
don't know what it's going
We
to.
wouldn't want to, I think that was where I had the question, and it was a little foggy, is if I don't have to use that SPBB and I don't have to disclose that I'm being paid with those closing costs, then I wouldn't want to tell them. You wouldn't want a seller who is hell bent on not paying a buyer's agent to know that closing cost. So as long as we don't have to disclose that and include that SPBB, I think that's going to be our best bet, is to negotiate as closing costs. So, okay, I have clarity. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So, I have a question. So do we have to, so if the seller's agent asks, why are they asking for a credit? Do we have to disclose it to them? Well, that's how they're going to pay me for my commission.
You can just say that's how they need additional funds in order to cover their closing costs. Your commissions are part of their closing costs. So you don't have to spell it out. You don't have to say, here's the itemized list of things they're going to pay for. It's just they need assistance with making sure they've got the funds to close escrow with their closing costs. So they're asking for a credit.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think that I see what you're saying, Adriana, and that's why I'm kind of like, why I was unsure about this. I think there's a gray area and a fine line, because we're working with our peers and people that we care about, and we want to make sure that we are not we could be elusive without being, not lying. Not lying. We don't want to do that. So we want to be careful. And as an agent, someone that lists a lot, like I don't usually ask what they need the closing for. So, but as long as we're not required to disclose that that's what they're doing, that was kind of where I wasn't sure.
Nope. And agents have been doing this for years, just so everybody knows, negotiating closing costs to cover a deficiency or to cover an increase. There are agents out there that ask for, have had the buyer representation agreement signed for years and ask for 3.5% to represent a buyer. And they always negotiate that as a closing cost credit, or the majority of time negotiate that as a closing cost credit in order to increase their commissions, whether or not that's in the buyer's best interest as far as like it's whatever value, right? So we've got to take whatever's being offered by the other side. We've always had the ability to negotiate up our commissions and to ask for it to be covered as closing costs, and never disclosed that that's what it was being covered for.
I was looking at properties that were sold in the 90s, and the SO commission was 4%. I
Yeah.
was doing some research on a property, and I just was looking all the way back looking for a permit and saw that it was like a crappy photo, one photo, no photos of the inside, and they're offering 4 to the SO. So it's nice to know that we actually have had leverage that we didn't use as agents. We were always afraid of this form, and it didn't actually hurt us. This form actually helps us and the buyer.
Yeah.
And so, ugh, this big long packet of paper, and it's good for us.
It's good for us. And I would say in our area, at least, if you look at what has been offered typically by the buyer or by the listing agent as the cooperating broker compensation, I would say our average is around 2.5% for a buyer, what's being offered to a buyer's agent. Prior to 2007, it was 3%. Like if you go back in the listing history and look at all the listings prior to 2007, you would almost never find something less than 3%. But then when we hit the market crash and short sales and all of that, then they started offering less, trying to make the sale go through and reducing commissions and offering what would be considered a less than average commission, which has now become average, and we just adapted. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that if you go back further in history, it was higher. And that's why your commissions can always be negotiated on either side of the transaction. So just kind of keep that in mind.
So let's say you have your broker agreement is at 2.5 and the property is offering 3%. Does that half of a percent automatically go to the buyer?
No, per this, the default goes to you. So right here on D,
Okay.
2, it's a third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation. The excess amount gets paid to the broker.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I want to double check.
Yep. Perfect. E4E is additional broker right to compensation. Broker should be entitled to the compensation provided for in 4A if within blank calendar days after expiration of the representation period or any extension thereof, there is or if there is a cancellation after the effective date of the cancellation in paragraph 4C, buyers enters into agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement provided prior to expiration of this agreement and any extension thereof, if there was a cancellation within the time paragraph. So what does this mean? It means that you absolutely should fill in a date right here. Okay, we absolutely should put in 90 days, 60 days, whatever that is, because what this says is, hey, if we agree to cancel this agreement, or if we didn't check box C2, if we left it at C1, if the buyer cancels this agreement, then even after 30 days have passed and this agreement is considered canceled, for an additional 90 days after the cancellation, I'm still due a commission for any of the properties for which I showed you and there was broker involvement during our period of representation. Okay, if we don't include anything here, then you have no right to compensation once the agreement has been canceled. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So I would always fill in something here. This is what's going to prevent them from canceling the agreement and turning around and making an offer on a property with another agent, or just going directly to the listing agent. You also want to make sure that we provide the buyer the written notice of the properties for which there was broker involvement on CAR form NBIP. Notice of broker involvement. Okay, that's what that is. So you want to make sure you're keeping a track record and history of all properties that you have seen or shown to the buyer, properties that you have sent them to, properties that you've called the listing agent on and gotten information on those properties for them, and then they decided not to see them at the time, right? So again, sending them the automated email from Barry's isn't going to count, from whatever system you use, but anything for which you've done some legwork on or showed them should be on that list. Okay. F is the disclosure of anticipated payment. So this is where it's, hey, broker prior to writing an offer on a property will disclose to buyer the amount of compensation the broker expects to receive from the third party. Okay, so that's either providing a copy of the MLS listing showing the cooperating compensation, although it sounds like that's going to be taken out of the MLS. So then we're going to have to get it directly from the listing agent. So you could use the form, the ABCD form, the anticipated broker compensation disclosure. That would be the appropriate form to use. Okay, we're also going to, through escrow, disclose the final compensation that the broker received from anyone other than the buyer. Okay. We can do that again on the ABCD form. There's a place for the close of escrow on that form as well. Or you could use a different form. We just want proof that you provided upfront that whether they're going to be responsible for any compensation or not. And then also at the close of escrow, what we received from other parties. Buyer is responsible for payment of compensation if the third party does not pay as anticipated. Okay. Timing of compensation, it's due, when the resulting escrow closes. Or if the buyer cancels, the purchase is prevented by buyer's default. So not buyer canceling the contract, but buyer being in default of the contract. Okay, those are two different things. If we have contingencies and such in place and the buyer cancels based on their legal right to cancel inside of the contract, that's not default. But the buyer just decides last minute, you know what, I decided not to purchase this home. I'm done. I'm out. I don't care. The seller can keep my deposit. And they decide to walk away from it by default, then you would still be due compensation. If acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when the buyer collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise. So if there's a lawsuit or something filed, the buyer collects damages, you're due to get paid through that. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Payment through escrow, it's going to be paid through escrow. This contract, this is what gives you the right to submit it to the buyer's lender and to escrow in order for the buyer to pay compensation. And if the buyer is going to be responsible for compensation under this agreement, we're not getting it all from a third party. You absolutely want to make sure their lender knows about that up front, because you need to make sure that it's okay with the lender and that they disclose all of that in their disclosures as part of the cost due to the buyer. Even though it's your cost, not the lender's cost, they still have to be disclosed as part of the loan documents. If buyer acquires a property during the time buyer is obligated to compensate another broker identified in paragraph 2, broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent buyer. So if the buyer contacts you and they're like, yeah, we have another agreement, here's the 5 properties that they showed us. And then they circle back and say, hey, I'd like to write an offer on one of those properties. You can be like, that's great. Unfortunately, because there's another agent that's due compensation, we have 2 options here. Number one, I can represent you. You're going to end up paying one of us compensation out of pocket. One of them is going to get paid by if the listing agent's offering something, right? Or number 2, you can turn to the other agent and ask them to write the offer for you, right? You don't have to represent them. You're not obligated to do so. And if you are going to represent them, you want it clear that they're going to owe 2 agents in this as part of this. Agency relationships, disclosure. Here's that agency disclosure, possible dual agency with seller. That's the possible representation, more than one buyer or seller. Broker authorizations and obligations, right? Here's what we're obligated to do under this. Broker authorizes, buyer and broker agrees to use reasonable skill and diligence to provide guidance and help buyer with the acquisition of property. Broker will assist buyer locating and presenting selected properties to buyer, presenting conditions following such acceptance. Presenting offers authorized by buyer and assisting buyer in negotiating for acceptance of such offers as applicable terms and conditions following such acceptance, and facilitating the escrow process for such accepted offers as directed and agreed with buyer, ordering reports and investigations, scheduling and attending meetings and appointments with professionals chosen by buyer, and upon request, providing buyer with a list of professionals or vendors who perform the services described in the attached buyer's investigation advisory. Provided broker has a referral list for such requested services, and upon request, assisting buyer with financing process by making referrals to lenders known to broker and assisting the buyer in obtaining the loan pre-qualification to the extent the broker can do so without acting as a mortgage loan broker. Okay, If property contains residential property of 1 to 4, we're going to do our AVID report, right? We're going to do a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection. And broker shall deliver and communicate to buyer any disclosures, materials, or information received by in the personal possession of or personally known to the individual signing for broker during the representation period. Okay, so we're going to disclose anything that we find out about the property to them. And we're going to do all that in compliance with the federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. The buyer's obligations are under Section 7, good faith. They're going to agree to timely view and consider property selected by broker and negotiate in good faith to acquire the property. Buyer further agrees to act in good faith towards the completion of any contract entered into for the property in furtherance of this agreement. Within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, they're going to provide relevant personal and financial information, including proof of funds, right? In case they argue about providing you proof of funds, pre-approval, pre-qualification letter to broker to assure buyer's ability to acquire property. Right, broker may cancel this agreement in writing if the buyer fails to do so or they're not qualified for purchase. So if your buyer's not quite ready, we sit down to have a conversation with a buyer and they're thinking, well, we're probably like 2 or 3 months out. We've got some things to take care of first. We may want to change this and say, hey, within 60 days, right? And so that they're not in breach of contract after 5 if they're not quite ready to get pre-approved fully or provide you proof of funds because they've got to save a little bit more money. Reasonable care and other professional assistance. Buyer is obligated and agrees to read all documents. We probably should underline that when they sign this form. They agree to read all documents provided to buyer. Buyer agrees to seek desired assistance from appropriate professionals. You may want to highlight that line as well. Selected by buyer, such as those referenced in the attached buyer's investigation advisory, and buyer is advised to read the attached buyer's investigation advisory and buyer transactional advisory for a list of items and other concerns that may warrant investigation by buyer or other professionals. Buyer agrees to pay for reports, investigations, and meetings arranged by broker on buyer's behalf. Buyer shall notify broker in writing of any material issues for which the buyer, such as, but not limited to, buyer requests for information on or concerns regarding a particular subject or interest of importance to buyer. I know nobody actually uses the BMI form, but there is a form for that you can provide to the buyer. And if they have any concerns about the property, in fact, we should be providing this to the buyer, they can jot them down on that form and hand it to you, and then you can submit that to the listing agent to get answers to those questions. The nice thing about that is that we're taking the buyer's specific questions. We're not interpreting them. We're not translating them. We're not communicating them to another party. We're taking them on a piece of paper and handing them to the other party to get those answers and get those things clarified. That's the BMI form. Buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, or hold broker harmless for all claims, disputes, litigation, judgments, attorney fees, and costs arising from any incorrect information supplied by buyer or from any material issues that buyer fails to disclose in writing to broker. Okay, so if we provide them that form, then we've given them the path they need to disclose any issues that would be considered material issues to them that they want further clarification on. And then we have our attorney fees and our dispute resolution, our mediation terms, the additional advisories that are attached to this form. You've got your line 11, other agreements. 12 is the entire agreements. Everything's in writing. If there's any changes, it needs to be in writing. If we're going to make changes to this document, it needs to be done on a modification of terms form. Although it's not called the modification of terms form, it's an MT form, and it's a modification of buyer representation or listing agreement, I think is what they call it now, but it's MT is the acronym for it. Here's where the buyer signs, and then here's where you sign. Dun, dun, dun. That's the buyer representation and broker compensation form. Any questions about that form? In addition to the form and all the documents at the beginning that got us to page 8, we're now on page 11, and we have a couple more forms. The buyer transactional advisory, right? It talks about general information, that it's a process. There's many different aspects. The information below is going to help you evaluate your role and the roles of other in the buying process. Here's your obligations, buyer. Here's my obligations as your agent. Here's the scope of my agent duties, right? So that's that form. You've also got the buyer inspection advisory that talks about the importance of property investigation, that brokers do not have expertise in all areas and therefore cannot advise you on many items such as those listed below. If the broker gives you referrals to professionals, broker does not guarantee their performance. Here are some areas in which you can and should investigate of the property: the general condition, the square footage, age, boundaries, wood destroying pests, soil stability, water, utilities, well systems, waste disposal, environmental hazards, earthquakes and flooding, fire hazards and other insurance, building permits, zoning, governmental requirements, address, rental property restrictions, safety and security, neighborhood area, subdivision conditions, and personal factors. Keep in mind, this page really only lists like a handful of them. The complete list can be found on the statewide buyer and seller advisory. So that's the other document that gets signed. Any questions about the buyer transactional advisory or the buyer's investigation advisory? We also have the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, which you'll see again on the purchase agreement. You also see it on the listing agreement. Basically, that it doesn't apply to us. That's the summary of that form. Hey, there's all this privacy and we can't control what gets disseminated to the internet. We can't pull pictures of your house off the internet after they're there and you've purchased it. And we don't really fall underneath the CCPA guidelines. The other form that we were going to discuss today, which I'll cover very quickly here, is our anticipated broker compensation disclosure. This is the ABCD form. This was mentioned as part of the BRBC form, as that we have to disclose to the buyer at time of offer what the compensation is being offered to us by third parties. This is the form that does this. There was a box on the BRBC that you could check, and you could do it at time that you show the properties. So it depends how you want to do that or what the buyer's comfortable with, but the default is at time of offer. You can supply a copy of the MLS printout that shows the compensation, but if they take that away on August 14th, then we're no longer going to be able to provide that. You're going to have to use this form or another document. This one's pretty simple. Broker's name goes at the top, buyer's name goes on here. Broker anticipates receiving compensation for the seller or the seller's broker. There's an other line here. I don't know what that would fall into, but if something changes in the future, maybe the lender starts offering compensation to us, who knows? We could check that box and put buyer's lender. I don't know what you would put there. So it's usually seller or seller's broker. Here's where you put the buyer's brokerage firm, license number, your name, license number. It's going to get a date there because you're going to sign it. Okay, this is where you sign the form, is up here above this line. Buyer's gonna sign here that they acknowledge they've read, understand, and received a copy of this ABCD form by initialing the box below. Buyer acknowledges being advised of the broker's anticipated compensation for the property identified. We can use this form over and over again until you've shown our written offers on 6 properties. Okay, there's 6 lines here. You can sign here. Buyer signs here. You could do this at the time that they actually fill out the BRBC, saying that, hey, this is the form that you're going to get. I'm going to sign that you've been advised that you will receive this form at time of offer. Each time we make an offer, I'm going to put the property address in here, the date that we saw it, the compensation being offered and where that came from, and then you'll initial for that property. So you can utilize it that way. Okay, so you could utilize this form over and over again. This is where you would put the street address of what you are writing an offer on. Make sure to put the full street address, street, drive, road, way, whatever it might be. Make sure you put that suffix. Make sure you put the city, oops, state, and zip code. Okay, whatever that is. There's our fake address. You're going to put the date. If we're going to go see properties, or we saw that property yesterday, we're writing an offer today, then yesterday would be the date that the property was shown. And we would say, hey, they're offering 1.5% of the price, or whatever's being offered. How did you find out about that? What it was it a cooperating broker compensation form? We're going to see that form a lot more, I think, as well. Those will probably be uploaded with the disclosures on like your home light listing management or your Glide site. It could have been the MLS, or it could have been per listing agent. Okay, so however you learned of what the compensation being offered by a third party is, you would put that in here. And then you might be multiple properties. We might be, hey, we're just writing an offer on this one today. Buyer would sign there. Okay, that offer doesn't get accepted, buyer goes to submit another offer, we would want to put the next street here, what's being offered, and they can initial it. Even if there's not a shortfall, we still have to disclose per the BRBC what that compensation is. Once they get to the close of escrow, then we're going to complete this bottom section. We're going to put in the final property of the one, maybe they decide to buy 123 Sample Street instead of 123 Sample Street. Okay, put city, state, zip there. And then you're going to put, here's the compensation from seller's broker in the amount of blank, from blank in the amount of, right? So if we were receiving 1.5% from the seller's brokerage, oh, it wouldn't be 1.5%. It would be, let's say the purchase price was 500,000 and we got 1.5% from the listing agent, then that would be $7,500. Okay, we're going to put in the dollar amount there. You have to do math. Let's say that we also negotiated an extra percent with the SPBB with the seller directly. Then we put seller in the amount of $5,000 because we've negotiated a percent on the SPBB. Okay, if we negotiate it as a closing cost credit, it doesn't have to be disclosed here. We would just disclose that, hey, direct from the third party, I'm being compensated from the seller's broker in the amount of $7,500. The other compensation technically is coming from the buyer, even though the seller is providing a closing cost credit for that amount, it's still being paid by the buyer. It's going to go as a cost to the buyer. Then you're going to put your information short review here. You're going to sign here. Okay. Buyer initials down here for this bottom part. So at the beginning, you sign here at the top, buyer signs at the top. Anytime we write an offer, we initial here in the middle section. And then at the close of escrow, coming up to the close of escrow, you're going to sign this bottom section and buyer's going to initial the bottom section. Okay. So you may decide to do one of these per offer, at which point at each time you offer, you would sign, they would sign, and they would initial. Or you could have them sign up front and then initial each time you make an offer. This bottom section only gets completed at close of escrow with a signature and an initial. Any questions?
I feel like this form is going to help us in our presentation of the BRBC because it just, I don't know, it kind of puts air back into the room when you're saying, I showed you to this house, so we're writing an offer on this house. Even if we don't do anything with it, I think I'm going to present this when I present it and say, this is the form we're going to use for this, so that they know. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Yeah, I think it just solidifies to the buyer that if the compensation is going to be less and you're going to have to pay me something to close escrow, this is our conversation piece. It will be disclosed up front. We will have a conversation about it.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fabulous. Any additional questions before we wrap up today?
Thank you so much, Amy. This is something I'm sure that I'm going to be asking you questions about.
And you're welcome to at any time. All right. Fabulous.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Thank you. Sorry I got under late.
No problem, Ralph. Thanks for joining us. I will see
You're
you
welcome.
all tomorrow. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.